moment of truth. President Bush says tomorrow is the last chance for a UN vote on Iraq. Saddam Hussein declares he's ready to fight the U.S. anywhere in the world. Inside the Pentagon's unprecedented plan for a so-called rolling start to war. And the death of a young American activist caught in the Mideast danger zone.
This is the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather reporting from CBS News headquarters in New York.
Good evening. President Bush concluded a brief Azores summit today with a warning that the UN has just one day left to act. Here's the latest. CBS News has learned President Bush may address the nation tomorrow evening. Saddam Hussein says it's a great lie that he has banned weapons. Secretary Powell suggested journalists and others should leave Baghdad. Germany told its citizens to leave. And the UN flew most of its inspection helicopters out. We began our coverage with Wyatt Andrews in the Azores.
Standing with what looked like a war council, the president threw down an ultimatum, not to Saddam. This was to the UN. Diplomacy, the president said, ends on Monday. It's yes or it's no.
We concluded that tomorrow is a moment of truth for the world by supporting the immediate and unconditional disarmament of Saddam Hussein.
But whether the U.S. forces a show of hands at the UN on Monday is unclear. The U.S. and Britain said only that a final round of diplomatic contacts would be made. An irritated president blamed the French for threatening a veto.
France showed their cards. After I said what I said, they said they're going to veto anything that held Saddam to account. So cards have been played. And we'll just have to take an assessment after tomorrow to determine what that card meant.
According to British Prime Minister Blair, what will not happen tomorrow is any more delay.
We cannot simply go back to the Security Council for this discussion to be superseded by that discussion, to be superseded by another discussion. That's what's happened for 12 years.
The president insists that war can still be avoided, but only with disarmament or exile.
Saddam Hussein can leave the country if he's interested in peace. You see, the decision is his to make, and it's been his to make all along as to whether or not there's the use of the military.
This summit in the Azores was billed as the final step of diplomacy, but the choice now facing the Security Council is say yes or step back and watch. Either way, unless Saddam leaves or begins a miraculous destruction of his weapons, the U.S. and its allies are very, very close to war. Wyatt Andrews, CBS News in the Azores.
Saddam Hussein said today that Iraq is ready to fight the United States and that the battle would take place, quote, wherever there is sky, earth, and water anywhere in the world, unquote. A short time ago, I talked with CBS's Lara Logan in Baghdad and asked her about Iraqi reaction to the Azores summit.
Well, Dan, so far there's been no official reaction, but the authorities here would have been listening very carefully to what was said, and the message that this is the final hour for diplomacy would have been received loud and clear. Also, the fact that President Bush virtually skipped the war and went straight to post-conflict Iraq wouldn't have been lost on the Iraqi president. And Saddam will probably dismiss George Bush's suggestion that he leave the country. In fact, earlier today, he indicated that this was the last thing on his mind. He was meeting with his top generals, and he said they've taken everything into consideration, quote, even the worst circumstances. So Saddam's message is just as clear. He's not going anywhere.
Now that we could be just days away from a war, has there been any change of the mood in Baghdad?
Yes, there has. You can feel that there's a difference here. There's a new tension in the air. And today the markets were crowded with people rushing to stock up on rations. People are taping up their windows to try to protect themselves from broken glass. And everyone I spoke to said they know that war is imminent. But they're trying to stay calm. They're trying to prepare themselves. And yet you still get the sense from some of them that they're genuinely terrified. And understandably so. Dan?
Lara Logan in Baghdad. Thanks. When or if U.S. and British troops launch their attack, they plan to use a risky plan, one commander compared to starting a chess game without all your pieces. CBS's John Roberts is with U.S. Marines in Kuwait.
The information has been closely held, but combat commanders have known for at least a week that war with Saddam would be a rolling start. Forces already in place would push deep into Iraq, even as more troops and equipment continue to arrive in Kuwait. The Army's high-tech 4th Infantry Division, which was supposed to open a northern front, now looks to be out of the early campaign. And the 101st Airborne Division, which could play a critical role seizing long-range targets, may not have all of its attack helicopters ready for weeks. Some officers privately worry they'll be spread too thin to respond decisively should Iraq throw them a serious curve, and that the attack timetable, to be outside the gates of Baghdad as soon as 4 days after the first shots are fired, could be significantly delayed. If it comes to war, this operation will be unlike anything ever seen before. Massive, lightning swift, with simultaneous operations involving a number of different branches of the military. The potential for battlefield confusion over who is who will be enormous. In the first Gulf War, so-called friendly fire accounted for 25% of American battlefield deaths. Today's weapons are far more lethal than those of a decade ago, making identification of friend or foe even more critical.
That's the biggest fear that I have, mostly because U.S. forces generally don't miss.
So units are drilled to ensure that enemy forces are in fact enemy. U.S. armor and vehicles are specially marked to identify them. But in a campaign where the goal is to kill the opposing force before it even sees you, everyone here prays their fellow Americans take a hard look before they fire. John Roberts, CBS News, with the Marines in northern Kuwait.
One principal objective of the Allied forces will be to secure the heavily defended oil fields of northern Iraq. But Saddam may already be moving to sabotage those fields, as we hear from Alan Pizzey on the Turkish-Iraqi border.
The Iraqi soldiers manning these frontline positions probably know they will be little more than speed bumps if U.S. troops charge through to secure the northern Iraq oil fields. But the road to Kirkuk is strewn with other obstacles. Pentagon officials believe the rigs that sit on 10 billion barrels of known reserves have been wired with explosives. Saddam Hussein ordered Kuwaiti oil fields set ablaze at the end of the Gulf War, and military planners don't believe the Iraqi leader's claims that he will not burn his own. Intelligence gathered by Kurdish troops manning checkpoints along the front line suggests that morale among Iraqi troops is low, and many are expected to desert when the fighting starts. But a walkover cannot be taken for granted. Travelers from Kirkuk say the Iraqis have been digging defensive trenches and filling them with gas and oil, which they will set on fire when the war begins, in the apparent belief that smoke will hamper U.S. warplanes and paratroopers. This is a preview of what can be produced. Every evening, the Iraqis burn oil and gas confiscated from people trying to smuggle small quantities to sell in Kurdish areas. The shroud of noxious smoke is a grim reminder to the Kurds of what Saddam can do. They were gassed by his forces in 1988. Even urban areas like Erbil are within range of missiles that could carry chemical and biological warheads, Kurdish leaders say.
We are exposed, we are defenseless, we have no protection whatsoever.
The Iraqi soldiers on the front lines may feel the same way. Most evenings they can be seen trying to improve their bunkers and trenches on the exposed hillsides and waiting for something huge to go bump in the night. Alan Pizzey, CBS News, Northern Iraq.
Still to come on tonight's CBS Evening News, an American protester killed in Gaza by an Israeli bulldozer. Also, the mystery illness that has world health experts on alert. And how war worries are sounding a sour note for class trips. An American peace activist was killed in the Gaza Strip today, crushed when she reportedly tried to step between the Israeli military and its Palestinian target. David Hawkins has our report.
Rachel Corey, a 23-year-old from Olympia, Washington, was crushed to death by the Israeli bulldozer she was trying to stop from demolishing Palestinian homes in the Gaza Strip.
And the bulldozer drove up, and it kept going, and she tried to move back.
Other witnesses say that after the bulldozer had run over Corey, it backed up and ran over her again. She died later in a Palestinian hospital.
She was clearly visible. It was daylight. She was wearing a fluorescent orange jacket. They knew exactly who we were.
Corey was a member of the International Solidarity Movement, which describes itself as a group of nonviolent activists defending Palestinians from Israeli violence and occupation. 3 days ago, she told the Arab news network Al Jazeera she'd come to Gaza to help Palestinian children who'd had their homes destroyed or lost family members.
And we are proud of Rachel that she was able to live with her convictions. Rachel was filled with love and a sense of duty to her fellow man wherever they lived. And she gave her life trying to protect those that could not protect themselves.
The Israeli army called the American's death a regrettable accident.
But we must stress that there are ways of protesting and ways of protesting irresponsibly.
The U.S. government has yet to comment on her death. David Hawkins, CBS News, Tel Aviv.
Just ahead on tonight's CBS Evening News, the country's airlines running on empty. On this second day of a U.S. health alert, doctors in this country and others around the world are rushing to identify a deadly mystery illness in an effort to contain the outbreak. CBS's Gretchen Carlson has the latest.
German health officials said today the condition of a Singapore doctor believed to have been infected with the mysterious pneumonia-like illness has worsened. The man who showed symptoms of the disease was quarantined in Frankfurt on Saturday after being taken off a New York to Singapore flight. So far, the illness known as severe acute respiratory syndrome has killed 9 people and infected more than 150. Most of the countries affected are Asian, including China, Indonesia, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam, as well as Canada and now Germany.
The concern is that, number one, we don't know exactly what the organism is. Number two, we don't know what the incubation period is.
In Asia, health workers are taking precautions in treating patients. And while no cases have been identified in the U.S., the Singapore doctor reportedly visited a New York hospital last week. And a woman who had been on a business trip to Atlanta is now hospitalized in Canada.
You have to have intimate contact because all the people who were infected had intimate contact with the people who originally had these cases.
The CDC is analyzing samples to try and determine whether the disease is a virus or bacteria, but says it does not appear to be bioterrorism. Still, U.S. officials are advising travelers to postpone non-essential trips to any of the affected countries. Gretchen Carlson, CBS News, New York.
American Airlines begins emergency talks tomorrow with flight attendants and ground workers desperately trying to avoid landing in bankruptcy court. It's also hired a leading bankruptcy lawyer. Tony Guida reports on hard times for the airlines.
When you want to leave?
Tomorrow, Saturday.
Tomorrow?
More and more travelers are leaving these days on airlines that are broke. Item American, the world's largest airline, is desperately trying to avoid bankruptcy as it loses $5 million every day. Item United, already in bankruptcy, needs to trim billions from its labor costs or, in the view of an expert at Standard & Poor's, face liquidation. Item Delta Airlines will lose close to $1 billion this year and won't make any money next year either. If that's not bad enough, war will make it worse.
It ultimately pushed 7 carriers into bankruptcy, 4 of which ultimately liquidated.
That was the 1991 Gulf War. The industry is projecting losses of $10 billion and 70,000 jobs if the U.S. goes to war with Iraq again. Just the specter of war has squeezed airlines unmercifully.
It used to be that the average traveler booked 3 to 6 months before they were going to take their trip. As a result of all the uncertainties that have developed over the last year, that's down to 1 to 3 weeks.
Airlines' cash flows are suffering as a result. Add to that the soaring price of jet fuel and backbreaking labor costs.
Labor, which used to represent 32% of operating expenses in the early 90s, and it now represents over 40.
No wonder American is asking its workforce to cut its compensation nearly $2 billion a year. A shakeout of some airlines may be just the medicine the industry needs, but it would likely bring higher ticket prices, a bitter pill for travelers. Tony Guida, CBS News, New York.
CBS next, more on the showdown with Saddam. Watching and waiting. Hans Blix decides what's next for the UN weapons inspectors. The UN's chief arms inspector said today he will present a new work plan to the Security Council on Tuesday. It reportedly calls for several more months of inspections. But as Jim Acosta reports, it may never be implemented.
At the mercy of events that are out of his control, United Nations Chief Weapons Inspector Hans Blix could only watch as President Bush issued his deadline for diplomacy.
Does this mean we're nearing the end of the inspections process?
Well, I think that depends upon the Iraqis primarily. Is there something they can do to demonstrate that they really do their best?
Blix says Iraq can do that by continuing the destruction of its Al-Samud missiles, by allowing its scientists to leave the country to answer questions, and by proving it's destroyed all chemical and biological stockpiles. Iraqi officials have invited Blix to Baghdad to discuss disarmament this week. But that would mean disregarding Secretary of State Colin Powell's warning to inspectors.
Each person in Baghdad, whether a news person, an inspector, or in some other capacity, has to take a look at whether or not it is not time to leave.
Well, I think that we will be there as long as we dare to. When the inspectors leave, I think everybody will also say that, well, this is the end of the day.
There are signs the end is coming. Most of the inspectors' helicopters have left Iraq, and the number of inspectors has dwindled to its lowest level in months. Hans Blix wants more time.
I don't think it's reasonable to go on year after year, but I'm not sure that it's reasonable to close the door after 3 months either.
Tomorrow, Blix is scheduled to update the UN Security Council on the future of weapons inspections in Iraq. That is, if there is a future. Jim Acosta, CBS News, New York.
Next up on tonight's CBS Evening News, teenagers learning the hard lessons of world politics. Finally tonight, more and more American students these days are learning an unwelcome lesson about security and vigilance. Cheryl Atkinson reports on the security fears that are stopping an increasing number of class trips cold.
The McLean High School band is in full practice mode, hoping against hope that its trip to China next month will go on as planned.
As of now, we're going to go, and I'm not going to let the war stop me from going.
Not only do the students feel it's an honor to be asked to perform, they've worked hard to come up with the $2,500 it'll cost.
We just stood outside supermarkets and begged for money, and then we had 2 fruit sales.
Spring is when thousands of American students hit the road, taking their education out of the classroom and into the real world. But the real world is threatened with war. Many trips are being rebooked away from once high-risk areas like New York and Washington. Other trips, especially overseas, are being canceled altogether.
We will consider the safety of the students to be the primary issue here.
McLean's band will go to China only if the government's new color alert system says it's safe. For now, the risk is at yellow, the moderate level. War will change that.
And if we go to code red, one of the immediate effects of that is the cancellation of overseas trips and activities.
I would say go, definitely.
These middle schoolers disagree. They just returned from a 10-day trip to France. They stayed with French families and saw Paris for the first time.
Paris, you always hear about Paris as a city of romance, you know.
For the students, this is a life-changing experience.
Principal Moreno Carrasco understands parents' worry.
But I think the benefit of these trips is so incredible that we really should not lose sight of those trips.
France est le plus vieux, yeah.
Meanwhile, McLean's band plays on and hopes for the best. Cheryl Atkinson, CBS News, Washington.
And that's part of our world tonight. Later on CBS, 60 Minutes and the story of reservists and the Iraq War. And then we'll be back tomorrow night with a complete Iraq wrap-up on the CBS Evening News. For now, Dan Rather, CBS News in New York. Good night.
For news 24 hours a day, go to cbsnews.com, AOL keyword CBS News.